In the beginning, everything about my marriage felt like a dream. I still remember the day I met him. His smile was the kind that drew people in, his confidence made him stand out, and his attention made me feel special in a way I had never experienced before. Our love grew quickly, and with it came promises of forever, late-night talks about the future, and small gestures that made me believe I had found my soulmate. For years, I carried that belief with me, holding on to the idea that no matter what challenges came our way, we would face them together. But as time passed, little cracks began to appear. At first, they were so faint that I ignored them, dismissing the uneasiness in my heart as overthinking. He worked long hours, came home late, and often seemed distracted even when he was physically present. I told myself it was just stress, that he was working hard for us, for the life we had planned. I wanted to trust him, to believe in the man I had fallen in love with. Then, he began to share things with me that caught me off guard. Casual comments at first, about fantasies, about excitement, about how relationships should never become too predictable. I laughed him off, thinking he was just joking or trying to lighten the mood. But the more he spoke about it, the more I realized he wasn't joking. There was a longing in his voice, a spark in his eyes whenever he mentioned how thrilling it would be to try something different. I didn't know whether to feel flattered that he was opening up to me or unsettled by what he truly wanted. I tried to play along, telling myself that every marriage required compromise, that maybe this was just a harmless part of his imagination. But deep down, I felt a shift. He was becoming more distant, more invested in these ideas than in the quiet moments we used to share. The man who once held me close during storms now seemed to be chasing something I couldn't see, something I couldn't fully understand. I started noticing small things, his phone always on silent, his quick habit of turning the screen away when I walked into the room, the way he guarded his privacy more than before. These weren't habits he used to have. My heart told me something wasn't right, but my mind kept insisting I was being paranoid. I convinced myself to ignore the late-night whispers on the phone, the sudden unexplained meetings, and the way he seemed both restless and distant. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that his fantasy wasn't just a thought anymore, it was becoming something more. And then, one evening, he looked at me with a strange intensity and asked for something that left me frozen in silence. His words were casual, but the weight of them pressed against my chest like a stone. It was in that moment I realized, my marriage was no longer the same, and my husband was no longer the man I thought he was. After that night, his words lingered in my mind like a shadow I couldn't escape. I tried to tell myself it was just curiosity on his part, that maybe if I ignored it, things would go back to normal. But instead, his desire grew stronger, and with it, the distance between us widened. He began to speak more openly, almost as if he had been waiting for me to break down and agree with him. What he wanted wasn't just a fantasy anymore, it was becoming an obsession, and I could feel it pulling him away from me. I remember sitting across from him at dinner one evening, watching him scroll through his phone with a smile he didn't bother to hide. I asked what was so funny, and he brushed it off with a casual, just a meme. But I knew better. His eyes lit up in a way they no longer did when he looked at me. That hurt more than I could admit. My husband, the man who once made me feel like I was the center of his world, was now finding joy somewhere else, in something else, something I didn't understand. At first, I tried to meet him halfway. I thought maybe if I entertained parts of his fantasy, he would see that I was willing to try, that he didn't need to look elsewhere. I told myself this was just another stage in marriage, one that required flexibility and patience. But every time I tried, it felt like I was losing myself. The things he wanted didn't feel like love to me. They felt like betrayal disguised as adventure. And the more I gave, the less he seemed satisfied. It wasn't long before I began to notice clearer signs. He was always on his phone, late at night, typing quickly and smiling to himself. Sometimes I'd wake up in the middle of the night and find the bed empty, the glow of his phone screen shining from the living room. If I asked about it, he'd laugh it off and say I was being dramatic. You know I'd never hurt you, he'd insist, but his words felt empty. My heart told me something was wrong, but I still wanted to believe him. I still wanted to protect our marriage. That's what made every little discovery feel like a stab in the chest. The scent of perfume on his shirt, the unfamiliar number that kept calling, the way he avoided my eyes when I asked direct questions, it was all too much to ignore. The breaking point came one afternoon when I picked up his phone while he was in the shower. My hands shook as I scrolled through his messages, hoping to find nothing, desperate to prove myself wrong. But instead, I found conversations filled with flirtation, with promises, with words he hadn't said to me in years. The messages confirmed what my heart had feared all along. His fantasy had stepped out of his mind and into reality. When he came out of the shower, I couldn't even look at him. I placed his phone back where it was and carried the weight of that discovery in silence. My chest ached with the truth I had uncovered, but I couldn't bring myself to confront him yet. I wasn't ready to hear his excuses. I wasn't ready to see the guilt, or worse, the lack of guilt, in his eyes. That night, as he kissed me goodnight like nothing was wrong, I stared at the ceiling, realizing that the man lying next to me was already slipping away. He wasn't mine anymore. He belonged to his fantasy, to the lies he had built, and to the woman, or women, he was sharing them with. The truth finally came crashing down one evening when I could no longer silence the storm inside me. I had been living with suspicion for weeks, maybe months, and the weight of it was suffocating. That night, I decided to follow my instincts. He told me he was going to meet a friend from work, but something in his voice felt rehearsed. My heart raced as I got into my car and drove after him, each mile filling me with dread. When I finally saw him pull into a quiet restaurant on the edge of town, my worst fears materialized before my eyes. Through the glass, I saw him sitting across from another woman. He wasn't just talking, he was smiling in that intimate way he once reserved only for me, leaning in, laughing, his hand brushing hers. It was the kind of tenderness I had begged for, the kind I thought had died between us. My stomach turned, and I couldn't bring myself to go inside. Instead, I sat there, watching the man I thought I knew betray me in the most obvious, cruel way. When he came home later that night, smelling faintly of perfume, I confronted him. The words poured out of me in a mixture of anger and heartbreak. "Who is she?" I demanded. His face froze, and for a moment, I saw fear flash in his eyes. But almost instantly, he shifted into defense, accusing me of spying, of being paranoid. He tried to twist the narrative, saying I was imagining things, but I had seen too much. I shouted, cried, begged for honesty, but the more I pushed, the colder he became. Finally, with a sigh of resignation, he admitted it. Yes, he had been seeing someone. He said it so casually, as though it wasn't the earthquake that shattered my world. His justification was worse than the confession. He claimed he hadn't stopped loving me, but his fantasies, his desires, had grown too strong to ignore. He said he needed variety, that I couldn't understand the thrill he was chasing. It wasn't about love, he argued, it was about excitement. But to me, every word was a dagger. I remember standing there, trembling, asking him if our years together meant nothing. He didn't answer, or maybe his silence was the answer I had dreaded all along. In that moment, I realized the man I married no longer existed. What stood before me was a stranger, someone who valued his impulses more than the vows we once made. The days that followed were unbearable. The house felt hollow, every corner filled with echoes of memories now tainted by his betrayal. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, and when I looked in the mirror, I barely recognized myself. The woman staring back at me was broken, her eyes dimmed by pain and sleepless nights. Yet, despite all of this, he continued. Even after being caught, he didn't stop. He grew bolder, more careless, as if my heartbreak didn't matter. That was when I understood, this wasn't just a mistake or a lapse in judgment. This was a choice, and he was choosing his fantasy over me, over us, over everything we had built together. The realization was devastating, but it also sparked something inside me, clarity. Our marriage, as much as I wanted to save it, was already gone. The trust was shattered, and no matter how many apologies or excuses he could offer, nothing would piece it back together. My husband. The day I finally walked away wasn't filled with shouting or tears, it was strangely quiet. I woke up that morning and looked at him sleeping beside me, and I realized I didn't know this man anymore. His face was familiar, but his heart was no longer mine. The love that once bound us together had been replaced with lies, secrecy, and betrayal. For weeks, I had clung to the hope that things could be fixed, that maybe he would choose me over his fantasies. But deep down, I knew the truth. He had already chosen, and it wasn't me. Packing my things felt surreal. Every item I placed in my suitcase carried memories, our first vacation, our first home, our wedding. But instead of feeling like treasures, they felt like heavy stones weighing me down. I realized I couldn't carry those pieces of the past with me anymore. As I zipped the bag shut, a strange calm washed over me. For the first time in months, maybe even years, I felt like I was taking control of my life again. When I told him I was leaving, he barely looked up. He tried to downplay it, saying I was being dramatic, that every marriage went through phases. He promised to change, but his words were hollow, empty rehearsals with no meaning behind them. I had seen enough to know that promises meant nothing when actions told a different story. I looked at him one last time and realized the man I once loved didn't exist anymore. He had been replaced by someone I couldn't recognize, someone who had let his desires consume him. The weeks that followed were some of the hardest of my life. The silence in my new apartment was deafening. At night, I would lie awake, replaying everything in my head, wondering if I could have done something differently. The what ifs haunted me. What if I had been more adventurous, more understanding, more forgiving? But slowly, I began to see the truth. His choices were never about me. His betrayal wasn't a reflection of my worth, it was a reflection of his weakness. With time, the pain began to soften. I started focusing on myself, rediscovering the parts of me I had lost while trying to hold our marriage together. I went back to old hobbies, spent time with friends I had drifted away from, and learned to enjoy the quiet without feeling lonely. I found strength in places I never thought to look, in the pages of books, in long walks under the evening sky, in the simple act of choosing myself every single day. Meanwhile, I heard through whispers that he was still chasing his fantasies, still searching for something new, something different. It broke my heart for a moment, but then I realized, it wasn't my burden anymore. His life, his choices, his emptiness, none of it belonged to me. I had given him my love, my loyalty, my trust, and he had thrown it away. That loss was his, not mine. Looking back now, I don't see myself as a victim. Yes, my marriage ended in betrayal, but it also gave me something unexpected, freedom. I learned that love without respect is not love at all, and that staying in a broken relationship only breaks you further. Walking away was the hardest decision I ever made, but it was also the bravest. In the end, his fantasy destroyed our marriage, but it gave me back something far more important, myself. And that, I have realized, is the greatest love story I will ever live.